Bully slapped black elderly veteran in a diner. Not knowing her son was head of Homeland Security, Brad's hand exploded across her face. Her head snapped sideways, glasses flying through the air before clattering against the counter. Scalding coffee splashed into her lap, burning through fabric. For one frozen second, Murphy's diner fell silent. Forks hovered mid-air. A waitress stopped mid-pour. A child's straw wrapper paused mid-twist. Even the bacon on the grill seemed to hold its sizzle, as though the entire room recoiled with her. She was 78. A black war veteran with medals tucked away in a drawer at home and scars she never spoke about. And now this man, this swaggering bully, had struck her. Brad shoved her again, his breath sharp with beer and spite. "I'll teach you a lesson, old fool," he snarled, as if the slap wasn't enough, as if the diner itself belonged to him. But what Brad didn't know, what nobody in that diner yet realized, was that this was no ordinary woman. By laying hands on her, he hadn't just started a fight in a booth. He had lit a fuse that would burn far beyond Murphy's diner. The diner went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. A waitress froze mid-pour, coffee bleeding into a brown halo on a saucer. A boy clutched a straw wrapper in mid-twist. Even the grill seemed to hush, bacon fat opting not to pop at that exact second, as if the room were holding its breath to see what happened next. She found her balance, and, with the care of someone who has learned to conserve motion, reached for the handkerchief tucked beneath her sleeve. A quick dab to the lip, red came away. She studied it as if she were making a clinical note she would record later. Then she looked at him fully. Her eyes did not beg, they assessed. "Sit down," Brad snarled. "That seat's mine. You hear me?" "No," she said, and the word was quiet enough that the room had to lean toward it. "It isn't." He was big, the way a man gets big from being told his size is a kind of argument. Work boots, cargo jacket, a jaw that had learned to clench before it learned to reason. A local from the accent, the kind of man who read a situation as territory and a person as an obstacle. He had arrived like a bad thunderhead, pushing through the door with the impatience of someone already angry, already owed something. He spotted the corner booth, her corner booth, where the window caught morning sun, and marched straight to it like a soldier who knows only advance. She had been there since 7 a.m. coffee, half a grapefruit, oatmeal with a ripple of cream she never stirred in. Routines were gravity. The seat faced east. When the sun cleared the elm across Johnson Street, the light warmed the scar that ran like a thin chalk line just below her left eye, and she always closed her eyes for that 2 minutes. No one noticed the ritual but her and the waitress who saved the table without saving it. No sign, no reservation, just a pocket of respect the regulars understood. Before we continue this thrilling story, hit like and subscribe to the Black Voice Matters channel. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The waitress, Lila, 32. Hair up with 2 stubborn strands always falling, had tried to intervene when the man strode in, chin forward, the bell on the door still jangling when he barked, "Move it!" "Sir," Lila had said, putting herself in the narrow aisle as seamlessly as slipping into a familiar pair of shoes. "We've got the counter free. There'll be another booth in a second." "I said move," the man said, and he leaned into the word, giving it weight like a shoulder against a door. He wasn't looking at Lila at all, only at the woman in the booth, the woman whose cardigan was the mild grey of November fog and whose hands were folded loosely on the formica. "I heard you," the woman said. "I'm not done." "You are now." That was when his hand came across, fast as a habit. She did not cry out. The echo did the crying for the room. A fork dropped somewhere. Someone said, "Jesus." Someone else said nothing and would later tell themselves that silence was neutrality. Her cheeks warmed where the skin had stung. The sting was an old flavor. She had trained herself to catalogue sensations in combat. The heat of a muzzle flash, the dry bite of sand, the sour tang of fear. This was less than all of those. This was a man mistaking a booth for a throne. "You don't talk to her like that," Lila said then, voice finding its backbone. She placed the coffee pot down, hands free. She stepped closer. The man's eyes flicked to her, then back, because the person who refused him was still sitting, still claiming space he had decided was his. "Brad," someone near the door said in a hushed, pleading tone that meant they knew him, maybe from a job site or a bar. "Come on, don't." His friends didn't move, not yet. People were always waiting for someone else to start the correction. He pushed the woman again. Fingers splayed against the upper arm this time, not her face. A ruling shove. She slid an inch on the vinyl. The old springs made a noise like a sigh. He waited for her to slide again. She did not. "I'm not moving," she said, and there was more in the sentence than words. It carried years, a night flight from some airfield with her duffel strapped tight, the sound of a helicopter's rotor washing a field into a single thudding heart, a hospital ward where she taught herself to sleep, sitting up because her leg twitched when she tried to lie flat. It carried the way men had said ma'am to her because of the uniform, and then stopped saying anything at all when she walked past them later in a grocery aisle in civilian clothes. It carried her first morning back in this town, when she had walked into Murphy's and chosen this booth because the light was gentle and the window looked out where she could see who was coming and from how far. The boy with the straw wrapper finally twisted the last of it free, and it made the tiniest, most human pop. "Lady," Brad said, shaping the word into an insult. "Don't make me." "Don't make you what?" she asked, as if she were checking a checklist, as if he were the one who needed to qualify for something. His mouth tightened. He grabbed at her forearm to haul her up. That was when the man at the end of the counter, blue tie loosened, sleeves rolled, stood so abruptly his stool scraped a hard line across the tile. "Hey," he said, and everyone heard the moment he used up the last of his courage in a single syllable. Brad looked over, measuring. He wore the heavy confidence of a bully who knows most confrontations die of natural causes. He let go of her arm, not because he had been stopped, but because he had decided he could take his time. He drew himself up to full height and addressed the room. "She's in my seat," he announced, as if the world were a courtroom and he were both prosecutor and judge. "It's her booth," Leela said. "Everyone knows that." "Everybody but me," he said, grinning with an effort that never reached his eyes. A cook peeked over the pass, spatula in hand. The radio behind him whispered an old soul tune that no one could hear anymore. The morning sun crept across the window like a careful animal and touched the woman's scar. She did not close her eyes for it today. She watched the man watching her. "What's your name?" she asked him. He blinked. People didn't ask that. People argued or appealed or yelled. They didn't inquire. "Brad," he said reflexively, and then he squared up as if realizing he had handed her something. "Brad," she repeated, and somehow she made the syllable gentler than a condemnation and sharper than one. "I have had this seat for years, since I came home. I come here, I drink my coffee, I watch the sun get up right there." She nodded toward the elm, and I remember the ones who didn't get to come home and grow old enough to be in anyone's way. "You're trying to make me feel bad?" he scoffed. "I don't know what you can feel," she said. A man in a trucker cap near the door took out his phone and set it on the table, camera at an angle that didn't announce itself. He wasn't brave enough to hold it up. He was brave enough to record. He told himself that counted. It might, later, not as much as it should have now. Brad reached across the table. The movement was ugly and unpracticed, a heat-seeking lunge. He grabbed for the woman's cardigan and the fabric tugged at the neckline, revealing for a second the thin dog tag chain she still wore. The tags were not there. Those lived in a box in her top drawer at home beneath a photo and a folded triangle of flag, but the chain had a little weight charm, a habit. It flashed and vanished. "What is it you think you're owed, Brad?" she asked. "What? That seat," he said. "You can have the seat," she said, "when I'm done." There was the smallest tremor at the corner of her mouth. Not fear, calculation. She was too old to trade blows, too wise to escalate, too proud to surrender. She was now assessing the room for allies, exits, tools. Training lived in the spine. The coffee cup, still half full, wasn't a weapon, but it had heft. The sugar shaker could blind a second, the napkin holder could bruise. The cane she sometimes carried wasn't with her today. She had left it by the door with the umbrella stand because the morning felt steady and the sky promised no rain. "Ma'am," Lila said, voice breaking on the last consonant. "Let me call—" "You'll do nothing," Brad snapped, turning. The motion bought the old woman an inch of time in a world that measured everything in inches at moments like this. She rose, not to leave but to stand at an angle that gave her feet under her and her shoulders square, even small, even thin. She arranged herself in a geometry that announced balance. The far corner of the diner watched the rearrangement of power without understanding its math. Brad saw only height and mistook it for advantage. He took a step forward. She did not retreat. He grinned again, but it wavered when she met his gaze stonily. He had hit a lot of people in his life who dropped their eyes. She did not. "Brad," came the friend again from the doorway, quieter and hoarse, as if saying the name wrongly could summon a better version of the man who wore it. "This isn't—" "Mind your business," Brad snapped without looking. The friend looked at the floor. He would hate himself later. He would try to defend himself later with sentences like, "I didn't know it would go that far." He would learn that it had already gone too far. The old woman's glasses still lay near the register. The cashier glanced at them, then at her, as if an object that helped you see was no good to you if you couldn't get to it. She could see fine enough. The world didn't blur unless she wanted it to. He tapped her shoulder with 2 fingers. It was almost a pat, almost friendly. The insult was the almost. "Move," he said. She looked at the fingers as if they were a clue. The hand that had slapped had been never taught to hold. "No," she said again, and the word put its feet down. He swung. Not with the open palm this time, with the tight fist of a man who had been told his force was a solution. A lunge, a twist, the mouth hard. The arc of his arm cut through the morning as rudely as a plane through a clear sky. She shifted, a half step back, a turn of the shoulder. He clipped her cheekbone enough to ring her ear. Pain sang, white light at the edge of sight. The body wanted to fold, her spine told it no. She steadied again on the table edge. Cups danced. Lila shouted, "Stop!" The man in the loosened tie took 3 steps that felt like 10, then halted when Brad wheeled and glared like an unleashed dog. "Call 911, someone said, finally finding an instruction. "Already did," someone else whispered, fingers shaking around a phone. Brad was breathing a little heavier now. Adrenaline is foolish. It flatters you until it tires you. He rolled his shoulders like he'd found a fight he liked and had forgotten that fights had outcomes. The old woman swallowed blood. It tasted like pennies and memory. She remembered a barracks nights where laughter arrived in sudden bursts as soldiers compared scars the way boys used to trade marbles. She remembered a quiet captain with careful hands telling her that you can't teach people to be brave, you can only teach them to act as if they are until they forget it's an act. She remembered coming home to the sound of her own kettle as if it were the first safe hymn. "You ought to be ashamed," she said to Brad, but she said it for the room. "This ain't church," he sneered. "No," she said, "it isn't. That's why it's worse." He hesitated. The sentence slipped somewhere he couldn't follow. He recovered by doubling down. "Last chance," he said. "Move." She reached, not for the coffee or sugar, but for her purse. Slowly, deliberately, she opened it and took out a wallet old enough to be soft at the corners. From it she slid a photograph, edges white, colors faded. A young woman in fatigues, helmet low, grin wide, hand on the shoulder of a man whose face you could not quite see because the sun had been cruel to that film. Another photo followed. Her at a thick wooden table with a boy of 10 beside her, his hair too long and his eyes too serious. The boy holding a plastic model of a helicopter, the table crowded with books and a half-solved crossword. "I am not moving," she said, laying the photos on the table like cards in a game where the stakes were not chips but air. "This is my seat. It has been my seat since the October I came back. I earned the right to sit in peace, anywhere a cup of coffee costs less than my pride." "You think I care about your sob story?" Brad laughed, but the laugh was thin. He glanced at the photos, not expecting the sight of them to nudge his mind into a quiet he couldn't name. "Maybe you don't," she said, and she lifted her chin a fraction. "But you will care about the consequences." The word prickled him. Consequences meant there was a world beyond this room and this second. He preferred both to be small enough to fit in his fist. A siren mewed faintly in the distance. It could have been going anywhere. The room decided it was coming here. Lila finally found her hands again and planted them on the counter like roots. "Brad, leave," she said, using his name as if it were a leash. He turned on her with a kind of delighted malice, because a new target is a relief to a coward. He took one step, then another. The man with the loosened tie stepped in reflexively, and Brad's palm hit his chest, shoving him back into the counter. The stool wobbled and fell, the clatter a clumsy cymbal crash. "Enough," the old woman said. And that single word had command in it. Not volume, not threat. Command. Heads turned because they recognized it without agreeing to. The cook lowered his spatula. The boy with the straw wrapper finally tore his gaze away long enough to slide out of the booth and tuck behind his mother. Brad blinked. Some part of him had been in rooms where a voice like that meant stop. Another part of him had been in rooms where no voice did. Those parts argued inside him as his face creased. She touched the scar under her eye with a fingertip, testing tenderness. "You've got one chance left to make today smaller than you want to remember it," she said. "Take it." "Lady, I don't take orders," he said, but the sentence lacked a little oxygen. "Everyone takes orders," she said. "The kind you choose matters." The siren grew closer. The friend by the door began to breathe again, as if air had returned to the county. "Police are coming," the man in the tie said, voice fast and shaky, finding courage in outsourcing it. "Good," Brad said, grinning too wide. "They'll get this trespasser out of my booth." Leela laughed once, a sound like a snapped twig. "Your booth," she said. "Honey, you've never been here on a Wednesday morning. That son belongs to her." The old woman's gaze softened toward Lila for a heartbeat, gratitude a warm flicker in a cold place. Then she turned back to the man who had decided that standing over someone made you taller. She did not raise her voice. "Brad," she said, "you're making a choice you will not enjoy owning." He opened his mouth to spit a reply he had already used 100 times on other targets in other bars. Before he chose the words, the door's bell jingled weakly as if even it didn't want to announce what came next. The room looked up as one. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, hands empty, eyes taking inventory. The siren cut off outside. The taller one scanned faces and saw the coffee on the floor, the glasses by the register, the old woman standing at the booth's lip with the kind of posture the academy tries to teach and rarely sees in civilians. He also saw the big man in the cargo jacket, with his chest half puffed and his fists not yet uncurled. "Everyone okay?" the shorter officer asked, and the 4 words landed wrong immediately. "She hit me," Brad said, fast as rehearsed sin, and the lie ran ahead of the truth like a child in a game of tag. The officer's eyes flicked to the old woman, then to Lila, then to the phone on the table tilted toward the scene. The taller one's mouth set in a line that lawmen wear when they know a mess will be on someone's desk by dawn. He moved toward the old woman. The room tensed because it had seen this dance before, and it rarely ended with the right pair leaving together. "Ma'am," he said, voice level. "Let's sit." She did not sit. "No," she said, meeting his eyes and measuring the man behind the badge. "Not until he does." Brad laughed and spread his arms, magnanimous. "See, she's refusing." "Sir, step back," the shorter officer said to Brad, automatically, the way you say slow down to a speeding car long after it has already flown past the sign. He didn't step back. He glanced toward the door again, as if expecting a different set of uniforms, as if his life had taught him that authority often came to reinforce his preferences. The friend by the door finally shook his head once, a small motion that said, "No cavalry for you, buddy." Brad didn't see it. The old woman's hands were steady now. She gathered the 2 photographs and slipped them back into the wallet so carefully it felt like an oath. Then she reached down, scooped up her fallen glasses, and set them on the table. The left lens was scratched. She didn't try them on. "Ma'am," the taller officer said again, a touch of impatience greasing the politeness. "Please." She turned her head just a fraction. Enough to keep Brad in view, but also meet the officer with the full respect she gave anyone who wore a uniform, right, and remembered why. "Officer," she said, "I have been assaulted in a place where I am a regular and a guest. I will not sit so that a man who hit me can feel taller." Brad snorted. "Assaulted," he mimicked, rolling the word in his mouth like it were too big for him but fun to chew anyway. The shorter officer looked at Lila. "What happened?" he asked. Lila breathed out. "He struck her," she said, each syllable like a brick she was tired of carrying. "Twice. Tried to drag her up. She didn't move because this is her seat." The officers looked at each other. A tiny calculus happened. Public place. Witnesses. An elderly woman with a bleeding lip. A large man vibrating with the residue of a cheap victory. The taller one adjusted the brim of his cap and made a decision. "Sir," he said to Brad, voice changing a degree toward official, "I'm going to ask you to place your hands where I can see them." Brad smirked in a way designed for crowds. "For what? For sitting down? For for assault," the officer said, and the word clipped the air. Before the room could ease, before anyone could decide the story was bending toward balance, the doorbell jangled again, and this time the sound seemed to ripple outward like a stone tossed into still water. Heads turned. Outside, over the officers' shoulders, black SUVs with government plates slid to the curb with the choreography of people who know exactly where to stop. A man in a dark suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, his tie unrumpled by ordinary gravity, his face set in an expression that was not anger and was not calm. It was purpose. For a heartbeat, no one knew what it meant. For a heartbeat, Brad grinned because he thought everything that happened was about him and for him. The old woman did not grin. She closed her hand over the edge of the table and told her body to hold, to be steady, to wait. The sirens were gone. The hum of the SUV engines murmured a new cadence under the diner's stale air. Lila's hands found each other, fingers interlacing like she had to keep them from reaching for a future that hadn't arrived yet. The man in the suit stepped in, scanned the room once, and saw her. Not the blood, not the booth, not the bully first. Her. Something in his shoulders moved that no one but him felt. Brad turned to face the new arrival, already pulling his mouth into a smirk shaped like a question. "You here to back me up or what?" The man did not answer with words yet. He reached into his jacket, and the taller officer's hands twitched reflexively toward his own belt before he recognized the movement wasn't for a weapon, it was for a leather case. The room's breath held itself again, ribs tight around it, as a badge flashed once in the flat diner light. The old woman's lip stopped bleeding. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe the room just forgot to notice. Brad's smile wavered. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. The sentence stranded on his tongue. The man in the suit took one step forward, eyes on the woman in grey, but his voice, when it arrived, didn't come to her first. It moved through the space like a true thing returning to its own name. "Who?" he said, each syllable measured. "Put their hands on my mother." Who put their hands on my mother? The words settled over the diner like a blanket thrown across open flames. For a moment, even Brad's smirk faltered, his mouth twitching as if he hadn't fully processed what he'd just heard. The man in the dark suit didn't need to repeat himself. His presence carried a gravity that made repetition unnecessary. But before anyone could speak, before the weight of that revelation could fully land, the woman, the one who had taken the slap, the shove, and stood her ground, let her fingers linger on the scratched lens of her glasses. She touched it like a reminder of something much older, much deeper than this morning's violence. Her mind drifted, not away, but into memory. Into the long corridor of her life, where dignity had always been tested. She was 19 the day she enlisted. The year was 1966, and the country was tearing itself apart at home, while tearing others apart abroad. Newspapers screamed about marches, riots, and a war nobody wanted to name properly. She walked into the recruiter's office in Montgomery with a face too young to be taken seriously. "Ma'am," the recruiter said, glancing at her paperwork, "you know what you're signing up for?" She had nodded. What she didn't say was that her father's voice echoed in her head. "If you want to be respected, you better be twice as tough, twice as sharp, and 3 times as patient, because the world ain't waiting for a black woman to prove herself." Boot camp was a crucible. Every shout in her face was both a challenge and a prophecy. They said she wouldn't last, that she was too soft, too small, too stubborn. She outlasted most of the ones who mocked her, running drills with a torn ligament, biting down hard on the pain like it was just another flavor of survival. She learned to shoot straight, learned to march long after blisters split, learned to keep her mouth shut when she was insulted by men who were supposed to be her brothers in arms, learned to fight anyway when the insult crossed into hands. By 20, she was in Vietnam. She still remembered the jungle heat, a wet heaviness that made every breath feel borrowed. She remembered lying belly down in grass while the world exploded above her, shells tearing chunks from the earth. One night, she pulled a wounded corporal 300 yards through mud slicked with blood. His leg was gone from the knee down, the bone white against the dark. She didn't think. She just pulled. Every inch, her muscles screaming, mosquitoes clouding her face, bullets stitching the air. For that, she got a medal she kept in a box at home. But she never told anyone the real truth, that when she looked at the corporal afterward, he stared at her not with gratitude but with shock, like he couldn't believe she had saved him. A black woman. Small, thin, and stronger than he'd ever imagined. The war gave her scars no medal could honor. One ran down her thigh from shrapnel, another across her cheekbone from a crash during a supply run. But the deepest one was invisible, the silence she carried back. When she came back to America in 1970, she expected parades. Instead, she got stares. At the diner the first week she returned, a man in a suit had sneered when he saw her uniform. "We don't serve people who kill children," he hissed. Another man muttered the N-word under his breath as if it were punctuation. That day she went home, opened her trunk, and folded her uniform into a neat square she would never wear again. She tucked it into the back of her closet and shut the door. But Murphy's diner was different. Maybe not kind, but different. When she walked in, the owner, Mr. Murphy himself, a heavy Irishman with a bald head, looked at her scarred cheek and didn't flinch. He pointed to the booth by the window and said, "Sun's best there in the morning. You'll want that seat." And she did. For 50 years, that booth became hers. Through jobs she took and lost. Through the loneliness of being dismissed for being too much woman in rooms full of men. Through the silence of nights where the war crept back in dreams. Through raising her son alone after her husband left, saying he couldn't keep up with a soldier. That booth was her sanctuary. Her place of peace. Her reminder that she had earned her right to sit wherever she damn well pleased. Now, in Murphy's diner decades later, the peace of that booth had been broken by a slap from a man who thought size gave him ownership. Brad shifted his weight, glaring at the suited man who had walked in with government SUVs at his back. He still didn't understand the danger he was in. "You her boy," Brad sneered, trying to find footing in insult. "Figures. Runs in the family. Mouthy and stubborn." The suited man's jaw tightened. But before he could reply, the woman raised her hand. Not to shield, not to plead, to pause. Her memories had risen too sharply for her to ignore. Her boy. He had been her anchor and her storm. Born in 1973, he was quiet at first, as if studying the world before choosing how to fight it. By 7, he was already protective, squaring up to neighborhood bullies twice his size who mocked his mother's limp or scar. She had taught him discipline, the way she had been taught, through structure, through honesty, through consequences. No excuses, no shortcuts. If the world won't give you a fair game, she told him, then you'd better learn to master the unfair one. At 12, he told her he wanted to be someone important. At 16, he told her he wanted to work for the government. So people like Brad don't get to push people like you around. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell him it was impossible. She just told him, then you better work harder than all of them. And he had. Now he stood in her diner, taller than she ever dreamed, power behind his name, asking the room a question no one dared answer. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Sir, who are you exactly?" The suited man flipped open his badge. The gold gleam caught the diner's fluorescent light. "Deputy Director of Homeland Security," he said. Gasps broke from the tables. A fork clattered. The young man recording under the table nearly dropped his phone. Brad blinked, his smirk faltering like a candle guttering in wind. But still, pride made him square his shoulders. "So what?" he said, his voice louder now, grasping at volume for courage. "Your mother was in my seat. She should have moved." The silence afterward was deafening. The veteran straightened her cardigan, blood drying at the corner of her mouth. "Brad," she said softly, "do you know what it's like to drag a dying man through mud with bullets snapping past your head?" He stared, confused, silent. "Do you know what it's like," she continued, "to come home and have people spit on you, call you names, tell you your sacrifice was worthless?" Her son's eyes flicked to her. He knew what she was doing, drawing the lines of the battlefield, shaping truth like a weapon. "You don't know sacrifice," she said, voice steel now. "You only know selfishness." The room leaned forward. Brad swallowed, but pride still made him mutter, "She's just an old woman. Nobody cares about her war stories." But someone did care. The boy at the corner booth, the one with the phone under the table, finally posted the video online. By the time Brad's words left his mouth, the video already had its first 1,000 views. Within minutes it would spread. An old woman slapped, her son storming in as Homeland Security, justice and rage colliding in one diner booth. The diner patrons didn't know it yet, but outside in the world, a storm had begun. She thought of storms. She had lived through plenty. Hurricane Camille in 1969, huddled in a barracks while the roof peeled away. The storm of racial hatred when she tried to buy a house in a white neighborhood, and the realtor told her politely, "This area's not for your kind." The storm of raising a son with no partner, scraping paychecks to feed him, and still slipping an extra $1 in his lunch so he wouldn't feel poor. Every storm had taught her the same thing: stand firm. And now, standing firm in Murphy's diner, she looked into Brad's eyes and saw not a storm but a hollow gust. A man who had never faced real fire, only created small ones to feel tall. The taller officer shifted awkwardly. He looked at the badge again, then at Brad, then at the bleeding woman. For a second, hesitation flickered. Whose side would the law fall on? Her son stepped closer, his presence pressing like a tide. "You're going to arrest that man," he said firmly, pointing to Brad. Brad laughed, hollow. "On what charge? She wouldn't move. That's it." "Assault," the officer said, his voice uncertain. "Public endangerment," her son added. "Elder abuse," someone at the counter whispered. Brad paled, but pride locked his knees. "You can't touch me." Her son's eyes darkened. "I can do more than touch you." The crowd shivered. For a moment, she let her gaze drift back to the window. The elm tree swayed slightly outside, leaves catching sunlight. She remembered the first morning she sat here after the war. She had ordered the same thing she did now: coffee, grapefruit, oatmeal. She remembered watching the light slide across the scar on her cheek and realizing she had survived when so many hadn't. And she had made herself a promise. "This booth will be mine, and no one will ever take it from me." That promise had lasted 50 years. Until today. Brad, desperate now, tried one last time to regain ground. He pointed at the veteran and shouted, "She's just an old fool. What makes her so special?" The diner froze again. The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her son stepped forward, his voice colder than any winter. "She's special," he said, "because she's my mother, because she's a veteran, because she's lived with more honor in one day than you could in a lifetime." Brad's mouth opened, but no sound came. And then the door burst open again. This time not with police, not with Homeland Security, but with reporters holding cameras. Someone had tipped them off. The story had gone public before anyone in the diner had time to breathe. The flashbulbs lit the booth, catching the old woman's bloodied cheek, her son's steady hand, and Brad's paling face. The war for dignity had just gone national. The diner door slammed against the wall as reporters surged in. Lenses and microphones pointed like weapons. Flashbulbs flared, bleaching the air in pulses of white. The old woman squinted against the glare, one hand shading her face. For 50 years her booth had been her private retreat, a sanctuary where time slowed and her scars went unnoticed. Now it was lit up like a crime scene, her blooded cheek broadcast for the world. "Ma'am, what happened?" "Sir, is it true you're Homeland Security? Was this a racially motivated attack?" The questions collided in the room, each one louder than the last. The crowd of patrons shrank back, suddenly desperate not to be in the frame, not to be immortalized as passive witnesses. Brad blinked into the cameras, his bravado faltering under the cold eye of public exposure. He raised a hand as if to block a lens. "This is crazy. She was in my seat, that's all. Ain't no crime in asking for respect." The cameras ate his words. Outside, a storm was already swelling. The boy at the corner booth had uploaded the first video barely 10 minutes ago. By now it had been shared across 3 states. By the time Brad spoke into the cameras, hashtags were trending. Veteran slap, respect her. Seat, Murphy's Diner. On Twitter, strangers argued fiercely. On Instagram, clips replayed the slap in sickening loops. On TikTok, voices stitched the video, narrating outrage, demanding justice. But in Murphy's itself, silence strangled the room. The bystanders who had said nothing when the slap fell, who had frozen while she was shoved and bloodied, now found themselves on the wrong side of history. One woman in the corner pulled her hat lower, as if fabric could erase her face from footage. A man in a business suit tucked his phone away, regretting he hadn't stood earlier. Regret was easy now, and the veteran, standing steady with blood drying at her lip, watched them all. Her eyes moved slowly over each face, a quiet inventory of their cowardice. "You all saw," she said finally. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "You saw, and you did nothing." Heads dropped. The shame was collective, thick as smoke. The taller officer cleared his throat, as if to reclaim order. "All right, folks, we need everyone to step back." But the reporters weren't moving. One shoved a microphone closer. "Officer, are you detaining the suspect?" The officer hesitated, eyes flicking to Brad. The hesitation was fatal. Cameras caught it. The world outside would see a uniform wavering between protecting a victim and placating her attacker. Her son's voice cut sharp through the mess. "You will arrest him," he said, every word deliberate. "You will file charges." The officer bristled, pride colliding with protocol. "Sir, with respect, we follow procedure." "I am procedure," her son snapped, his badge still open, "and procedure says you don't let a man walk out after assaulting an elderly veteran unless you want this entire department dragged into the same firestorm you see on those cameras." Gasps rippled. Brad's smirk faltered. "You can't." "Yes," her son said. "I can, and I will." But just as the officers moved to cuff Brad, the diner door swung open again. A new figure stepped in. Tall, clean-cut, wearing a pressed suit and a pin on his lapel that everyone recognized but couldn't quite place. The room seemed to tighten. The man strode forward confidently. "Officers," he said, voice smooth, "you'll hold off on that arrest." Her son stiffened. "And you are?" "Congressman Harold Keene," the man said, flashing his smile for the cameras, as if they were old friends. "Representative for this district. And I'm here to make sure we don't turn a small misunderstanding into a political circus." The air in the diner dropped 10 degrees. The old woman narrowed her eyes. Congressman Keene. She remembered his name. He had shaken hands at parades, promised funding for veterans' housing, and delivered nothing but photo ops. Brad's face lit up like salvation. "That's right. Tell him, sir. Just a misunderstanding." The congressman clapped Brad on the shoulder, smiling for the cameras. "We don't need to ruin a man's life over a seating dispute, do we?" Reporters snapped photos furiously. The optics were immediate. A congressman shielding a white man accused of slapping an elderly black veteran. Her son's jaw flexed. "You're interfering in an assault case," he said, voice sharp as broken glass. Keene smiled wider. "I'm ensuring fairness. Surely Homeland Security doesn't think it has jurisdiction over diner scuffles." The crowd buzzed. Reporters smelled blood, not just of a victim now, but of political scandal. The old woman reached for her glasses, sliding them back onto her face despite the crack. Through the fractured lens, she saw clearly. The battle was no longer just between her and Brad. It had widened, pulling power and politics into the booth she had claimed as hers. Her mind pulled back again, unbidden, to the day she had once gone to Congressman Keene's office. It had been the late 1980s. She was lobbying for better medical benefits for veterans, many of them black, many of them ignored. She had waited in a sterile hallway for 2 hours while young interns fetched coffee and shuffled papers. When Keene finally appeared, he shook her hand, thanked her for her service, and promised to look into it. Nothing came of it. For years, she had carried that meeting like a scar that didn't show. Now, here he was again, grinning over Brad's shoulder like the slap had been a handshake. The silence of the bystanders began to crack. Layla, the waitress who had tried to intervene, suddenly stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "This isn't politics. This isn't a misunderstanding," he hit her. "We all saw it." A ripple went through the crowd. The man in the loosened tie found his voice too. She didn't move because it's her booth. Everyone knows it. He attacked her. Others chimed in, their guilt finally burning into courage. "Yeah, we saw it," someone shouted. "It's on video." Cameras turned, capturing the swell of voices. For the first time, the silence broke into testimony. Brad's face drained of color. Kana's smile faltered. The woman finally stood straighter, shoulders squared despite her age. She looked at the cameras, then at Keane, then at Brad. "You all want to know why I didn't move?" she asked. Her voice carried through the diner, stronger than any microphone. "Because that seat is mine. I've sat there every Wednesday morning for 50 years. I fought for this country when it didn't fight for me. I bled in its jungles, buried friends in its soil, and came home to be told I wasn't wanted. And still I stayed. Still I sat. Still I claimed this booth." Reporters froze, pens scratching furiously. She leaned forward, her voice sharper. "And today, this man thought he could take even that from me. Not just a seat, my dignity, my peace, my right to exist." The diner was silent except for the soft click of shutters. She turned her gaze to Keane. "And you want to call that a misunderstanding?" The congressman opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a phone rang. Loud, clear. It was one of the reporters. The ringtone cut through the silence like a drill. He fumbled it up to his ear, whispered a few words, then went pale. He looked up, eyes wide. "It's already on national news," he said. "The president just commented." Gasps. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambling, cameras flashing brighter, phones buzzing with alerts. Brad's bravado finally shattered. His knees weakened. Canny's face went stiff, calculating the ruin of his career in real time. And the old woman sat back down in her booth. Calm, steady, as if reclaiming her throne. Phones buzzed like a hive in Murphy's diner. Every screen in the room lit up with the same headline splashed across news feeds. Elderly black war veteran assaulted in diner. Homeland security official steps in. The president's words echoed on live television. "No veteran should ever face disrespect on American soil. This nation owes its defenders more than silence." The entire diner froze. Brad swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating into sweat. Congressman Keane's grin stiffened into something brittle, a mask cracking under the weight of optics he hadn't anticipated, and the old woman, sitting once again in her booth, lifted her chin slightly, as though the world had finally caught up to the dignity she carried every day. Back in Washington, Homeland Security phones were ringing off the hook. The deputy director, her son, had excused himself from a morning counter-terrorism briefing, leaving senior aides stunned. Now across the Capitol, his name was being mentioned not in hushed halls of policy, but on every news channel. Homeland Security deputy confronts assailant of mother in diner. Diner slap sparks national debate on veterans' rights. The narrative was no longer just about one slap. It was about America's conscience, veterans, race, dignity, politics colliding in one small-town diner. And in the middle of it all was her son. He had grown up in her shadow, the son of a woman who taught discipline like it was oxygen. He remembered her voice as he struggled through school. Respect comes when you've earned it, never before. At 18, he entered the military academy. At 25, he was already climbing intelligence ranks, fluent in 3 languages, sharp-eyed and unyielding. He built his career brick by brick, fueled by the knowledge that his mother had been spat on by the country she bled for. He swore to build a system that no Brad could twist, no Keane could manipulate. Now, standing in Murphy's diner, his badge open, his authority unshakable, he was the embodiment of that vow. Congressman Keane wasn't done. He leaned closer to the cameras, pitching his voice for the audience beyond the diner walls. "We should not let emotions cloud reason," he declared. "This was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. My constituents want peace, not spectacle. Arresting a man for a seating dispute, well, that's politics gone mad." Reporters murmured, pens flying. The son stepped forward, cutting into Keane's spotlight. His voice was ice. "This wasn't politics, Congressman. This was assault. My mother is a decorated veteran, and your attempt to minimize her pain is noted." Gasps flickered around the room. Keane paled but forced another smile. "With all due respect, sir, Homeland Security isn't law enforcement in small diners. Let's not overstep jurisdiction." "Respect," the son repeated slowly, his eyes locking with Keane's. "You dare use that word while she sits here bleeding? Respect is earned, Congressman, and you've just lost it." The cameras caught everything. Keane's smile collapsed, his career teetering on the edge of collapse. A woman from the corner booth stood. She was trembling, but her voice carried. "I saw it. He hit her, twice. She never touched him. I saw it too, the man in the loosened tie added, his voice steadying. She was just drinking her coffee. Soon, half the diner was speaking at once. The silence that had once protected Brad now drowned him in condemnation. For the first time, Brad's knees shook. His eyes darted between the officers, the cameras, the congressman, as if searching for an ally. There were none left. Her son lifted a hand, silencing the room without raising his voice. He turned to the officers. You will place that man under arrest, now, for assault on a senior citizen and a veteran. The taller officer hesitated again. Cameras rolled, catching every flicker of doubt. The crowd leaned in. Would the law act or flinch again? The old woman leaned forward, her eyes narrowing on the officer. Do your duty, she said. That was the command he couldn't ignore. His hand went to his cuffs. Sir, he told Brad, hands behind your back. Click, click. The sound of metal closing around wrists echoed louder than any slap. Reporters surged, flashes exploding. Keene stepped back, panicking now. He fumbled with his phone, whispering into it urgently. But one of the reporters intercepted. Congressman Keene, did you just attempt to interfere with an assault investigation on camera? The room hushed. Keene's eyes darted. No, I was ensuring calm. Then why did you place your hand on the suspect's shoulder in support? Another reporter pressed. Shutters clicked furiously. The congressman's image, hand on Brad, smile wide, was already racing across feeds under the caption, Congressman protects bully who slapped veteran. The crowd hissed, low and sharp. Even Keene's own aides looked away. His career was crumbling before their eyes. The woman finally rose again, slow but deliberate, reclaiming the floor of her diner. She fixed her glasses, cracked as they were, and let her gaze sweep the cameras. You want a story? She asked. Her voice didn't tremble. Here it is. I fought for this country when I was 19. I came back and was told I wasn't worth a seat in a diner. 50 years later, I sat here again, and a man thought he could take that from me, but I didn't move then, and I won't move now. The reporters were spellbound, pens still, cameras frozen on her face. And if this country still believes in honor, she said, then it will learn that dignity isn't negotiable. Applause broke out. Not polite, fierce. Leela clapped hardest, tears shining in her eyes. The cameras caught it all. One reporter's phone buzzed. He gasped, then shouted over the clamor. Breaking Congress is calling for a formal inquiry into Congressman Keene's conduct. The White House just announced a press conference tonight. The diner erupted into chaos again. Voices shouted, cameras shoved, officers led Brad away in cuffs while he sputtered protests no one listened to. Her son leaned down to his mother. It's already bigger than this diner, he whispered. She nodded once. Calm, as if she had expected nothing less. Through the storm of cameras, through the flashbulbs and shouting, she reached for her son's hand, their fingers laced briefly, a gesture so small it nearly went unnoticed. Don't let them make me a symbol, she whispered. I'm just a woman who wanted her coffee. He squeezed her hand back. Too late, Mama. You've become the story. She sighed, eyes drifting to the elm tree outside the window. For 50 years, she had watched its leaves shift from green to gold, from bare to green again. She had wanted nothing more than to sit and keep watching, but the world had chosen otherwise. As the reporters spilled out of Murphy's to broadcast the story live, a new sound rose outside, chants. Through the window, a crowd was gathering. Dozens, then hundreds. Veterans with flags, locals holding signs, strangers who had seen the video and driven miles just to stand outside the diner. Their voices rose in unison. Respect our veterans. Respect our veterans. The diner shook with it. Brad, shoved into the back of a cruiser, stared in shock. Keene ducked from cameras, face white. And the old woman sat in her booth, blood on her cheek, dignity in her spine, and the chant of a nation rising in her ears. The chant outside the diner grew louder, shaking the glass panes until they quivered in their frames. Respect our veterans. Respect our veterans. The sound rolled like thunder, growing with each passing minute as more people arrived, some carrying flags, others clutching homemade signs scrawled in haste. Her seat, her right. Honor our soldiers. Dignity has no age. Inside Murphy's diner, The world seemed to shrink and expand at the same time. Shrink, because all eyes were still fixed on the elderly woman in her booth, blood drying on her cheek, her presence more commanding than any badge or title. Expand, because her story was no longer hers alone. It had become a national reckoning. Reporters shoved microphones forward, narrating live updates. The officers hurried Brad through the door in handcuffs, his protests drowned beneath the chants outside. Congressman Keene tried to slip out behind them, but cameras caught his face, pale and sweaty, his career unraveling in real time. And in the middle of it all, she sat, calm, steady, the eye of the storm. That evening, America paused. Televisions glowed in living rooms, bars, hospital waiting rooms and airports. On every channel, the president addressed the nation. No American veteran, he said, his voice solemn, should ever face disrespect or violence for simply existing in the country they defended. What happened in that diner is not just an assault on one woman, it is an assault on the values she fought to preserve. Let us be clear. Dignity does not have an expiration date. Service does not lose its worth with age, and silence in the face of injustice is complicity. His words poured like steel into the air. Across the nation, people leaned forward. Some wept. Some cheered. Some sat in uncomfortable silence, realizing they had once been bystanders themselves. In Murphy's, the woman listened quietly on a reporter's live stream. Her son stood beside her, arms folded, his face unreadable. She sipped her coffee, the taste bitter but grounding. By morning, Congressman Harold Keene was finished. Clips of him smiling and calling the assault a misunderstanding ran non-stop. His approval ratings plummeted overnight. Donors withdrew support. By noon, he announced he would not seek re-election. Reporters camped outside his office, shouting questions about why he had defended a man who slapped an elderly black veteran. His rehearsed answers: "I was misunderstood. I wanted peace. I didn't know all the facts," only dug him deeper. For the first time in decades, the congressman faced accountability. Brad sat in a holding cell, the reality of his downfall sinking in. The video of him striking the veteran replayed endlessly online. His employer released a statement, distancing themselves. His friends stopped answering his calls. He had thought himself untouchable, a man whose size gave him license. Now he was a national disgrace, his name synonymous with cowardice. At his arraignment, the charges stacked like bricks: assault, elder abuse, disorderly conduct. He tried to speak, but the gallery hissed. One woman shouted, "Shame," before the bailiff restored order. Brad's bravado had drained away. What remained was a man exposed, stripped of the illusions he had built his life on. Back in Murphy's diner, things slowly returned to normal. The reporters left, the crowds thinned, the booths filled again with families and workers grabbing quick meals. But her booth remained hers, always hers. She sat in it the following Wednesday, as she always did, the morning sun slipping across her scar. Lila poured her coffee, eyes still bright with respect. Other patrons nodded at her, quiet but reverent. But the veteran was not interested in fame or spectacle. She hadn't wanted cameras, chants, or headlines. She had only wanted her peace. And yet, she knew something larger had unfolded. She thought of her friends who hadn't come home from the jungle. She thought of the marches she had seen on television decades ago, demanding rights she was still fighting for in subtle ways. She thought of her son, who had turned her lessons into power, standing tall where she once stood small. And she thought of Brad, the man who slapped her, shoved her, and called her an old fool. She did not hate him. Hate was too heavy to carry at her age. Instead, she pitied him, for never learning that respect is earned not by force but by humility. Her son sat across from her, suit pressed, tie neat. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "They want me to testify before Congress about this," he said. She looked up. "About me? About what it means for veterans, for dignity, for race." She sighed. "They'll make me into a banner." "Maybe that's what we need," he said quietly. "A banner people can't ignore." She studied him. In his eyes, she saw the boy who once swore he'd protect her from bullies. Now he was protecting not just her, but every veteran, every elder, every silent casualty of disrespect. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Just remember, son, banners wave, but people live. Don't let them forget I'm a person." He nodded, his throat tight. Across the country, debates raged. On talk shows, callers argued about bystanders, about racism, about veterans. Churches gave sermons about dignity. Schools replayed the president's words. But the most powerful voices came from veterans themselves. Black veterans, women veterans, forgotten soldiers of forgotten wars, all wrote letters, posted videos, and told their stories. For the first time in a long time, people listened. Her story had cracked open a silence. On a quiet morning 2 weeks later, she returned to Murphy's. The diner was calmer now, the frenzy gone. She sat in her booth, ordered her usual, and let the sun warm her scar. A little girl at the counter turned in her seat, watching her. Finally, the child asked softly, "Why do you always sit there?" The old woman smiled, gentle and tired, but still strong. "Because sometimes," she said, "the smallest places hold the biggest battles, and when you don't move, the world has to." The child nodded, though she didn't fully understand. One day she would. Her son walked in, briefcase in hand, looking exhausted but proud. He kissed her forehead and sat beside her. And as the world outside debated, argued, and shifted, she simply lifted her cup, took a sip of coffee, and savored the peace she had fought so hard to keep. The moral was not about one slap, not about one booth, not even about one woman. It was about dignity, the seat no one has the right to take, the respect no one has the right to deny, the silence no one should accept. Because when one woman refused to move, she reminded a nation of what it means to stand. And in the end, the diner was quiet again. The world had changed outside its walls, but inside, in that corner booth by the window, justice had already been served. If this story touched you, please subscribe to support the Black Voice Matters channel. Hit like and share to spread the message far and wide, because stories like these deserve to be heard. And tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to shout you out in our next video.